confronting somebody else, we are standing upon our strengths and judging somebody else's weakness. And because of that, we want to impress upon them the truth that is on our heart and what we've seen, and they've got to accept it or they're out, and we're just going to reject them entirely. Even Solomon talked about this level of humility. He says, don't eavesdrop on others. You may hear your servant curse you, for you know how often you yourself have cursed others. And isn't that really true? Many times we don't see what's happening in the situation and we rush in thinking that we know the truth and what's right and wrong, only to learn that we are sadly mistaken. And we need to explore deeply our own heart. We need to ask ourselves 3 questions. What are my failures? What are the things that I struggle with in my own heart and life? What are the mistakes that I've made? Who are the people that I've hurt? When we begin to address our failures, it puts us in a place where we recognize I'm in need of God's grace and forgiveness. And I want to extend that same grace and forgiveness to the person I'm having this difficult conversation with. What are my motives? What's deep down in my heart? You know, sometimes we can do very good things with bad motives. And other times we can do very mistaken things with very good motives. And God looks at the heart. In fact, it says at the end of the age that Jesus will come and he will judge the secret things that are in our heart. What are your motives in wanting to have this conversation? Do you just want to prove that you're right and they're wrong? Do you want to punish them? You want to get them? You want God to come and smite them? I know you do. You know, you want to get even. Maybe you felt powerless in this relationship and suddenly now you're right and the other person is wrong and you're going to get power and you're going to come in and you're going to hit them with both barrels. What are the motives of your heart? All of those things really are bad motives for wanting to engage in this difficult conversation at all. It says a lot more about you and your heart than it says about even the relationship and the other person. Maybe you want to pour on some toxic guilt and shame so that just to make them feel bad, make them feel less. You know, God's really called us to be people of reconciliation. And some of the good motives that he's calling us to do is maybe to stop a bad thing or to stop an addictive cycle that's ultimately destroying this person's life. Or maybe it's to bring to light the person's contribution so that both of you can move forward or restore closeness or to achieve greater intimacy or to restore a breach in the relationship. You know, it's important that we engage in these conversations, but we've got to look at our heart. And we also have to ask, what are our fears? What are our fears? What is it that is motivating us? Maybe our fears are, we don't want to hurt that other person. I don't want to be rejected. We have a fear of disapproval. We have a fear of retaliation. What's going to happen if I say anything at my job or in my family or with my neighbor? A fear of loss, a fear of that person's anger. What are our fears? Sometimes we may even have a fear of embarrassment. You know, I talked to a couple one time and the wife in this marriage was so embarrassed by her husband because he would always share the same joke every place they went. And she was so tired of this joke. He thought it was funny. And he was kind of a goofy guy, and he just shared the joke, and he would laugh at himself sometimes. And he knew that people had heard it over and over, but he thought it was kind of cute. But she was mortified. And she had mentioned him a couple of times, and she said, you know, I'm just so embarrassed at him. He's so embarrassing. I wish he wouldn't be like that. I wish he would be more civilized and dignified. And suddenly, as we begin to process it, we realize this is much more about her fear of embarrassment than his behavior. And suddenly, she had taken her plank of her fear and projected it upon him. And suddenly she realized maybe this is something I need to process in myself and not process in the relationship. What are my failures? What are my motives? What are my fears? Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis said this in regards to the humility that we should walk into these conversations with. He said, for a long time I used to think this was silly, straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man. But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I'd been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself, and there had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things was that I loved the man. Just because I loved myself, I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. Consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty or treachery. We ought to hate them. Not one word of what we have said about them needs to be unsaid, but it does want us to hate them in such a way in which we hate the things in ourselves. Being sorry that the man should have done such things and hoping, if any way possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, he could be cured and be made human again. You know, this changes the whole context of when we have these conversations, doesn't it? Suddenly we need to approach them with a different level of humility. I actually had a professor in college. His name was Bill Crew, and he was just such an articulate man, very insightful. And there was, at that time, many very, very public moral failures and different things were happening, even with Christian leaders. And I remember him talking about confronting someone or addressing someone else's sins. He says we ought to have these difficult conversations, but when we do it, we need to have these conversations with tears in our eyes, because it reflects a heart that Christ wants us to have. So we take the plank out of our own eye. We look at our failures. We look at our motives. We look at our fears. What's driving some of these different things? Is it more about us than it is about them? And then we'll be able to see clearly. Actually, in Matthew chapter 6, in that same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this: the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, the whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body would be full of darkness. If then light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? How easy it is not to see our own failures. You know, when we have an issue with pride ourselves, the interesting thing that happens is we can see pride in everybody else because we're competing with them. When we have an issue with anger, we can often see anger in other people. When we have an issue with depression, we can see that depression in other people. You know, we project those things in and of ourselves. But when we take the plank out of our own eye, we begin to see ourselves clearly. We see that the ground is actually level at the foot of the cross. In fact, Paul said it this way in 1 Timothy chapter 1. He says, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, so that no one, it's not by works, no one can boast. You know, all of us need the grace of God. And when we approach difficult conversations, when we're confronting a spouse, when we're confronting that friend who has betrayed us or perhaps gossiped about us, we need to understand that we too need the grace of God, and we can see ourselves clearly. We can also see from God's perspective clearly. You've heard the story of the difference between crows and eagles. I've shared it a number of months ago, but sometimes crows and eagles, they fight over the same roadkill. They're both kind of scavengers. And the crows are in packs, big black birds, and they'll actually attack the eagle, and they'll fight with the eagle over the same piece of lunch. But the interesting thing about the eagle is he doesn't fight back. He just begins to circle and fly faster and faster and higher. All the while, the crows are trying to chase after the eagle, but the eagle just keeps flying faster and faster, higher and higher, until he's higher than the crows can go. And you know, it's interesting, the eagle, when he's so high, way above the ground, he looks down and can see the earth the way that God looks at the earth. And God's called you to be an eagle, to not get so enmeshed into the petty traumas of this world, but to speak the truth in love. And through prayer and through reflection and looking at your own heart and asking for God's help, to fly higher and higher and faster until you're too high for the crows. And you begin to see the situation from God's perspective. You know, I've been hurt deeply in my ministry before, and anytime you've dealt with people, sometimes, you know, there's pain, and you've experienced that pain, I've experienced that pain. And I remember just praying for this one man who just seemed bent on causing me difficulty. And as I began to pray, suddenly my resentment shifted to compassion. Because I saw this person for who he really was. I began to see the hurt of his life and the broken relationships of his life, and how so many different things had happened that had just all stacked against him, and he was projecting that pain now upon other people. And suddenly he became human instead of just being such an evil, vile person. And many times we lose sight of how God might see an individual. We want to make them all bad or all good. Many times I've talked to people and they're like, you don't know my boss. I mean, my boss is like the devil incarnate. The devil has visited the earth. He's my supervisor. And this guy is just as bad as they come. And it's interesting as you begin to talk to them when somebody's just all bad. My spouse is all bad. They do everything wrong. My neighbor is all bad. They do everything wrong. You would not believe some of the things they've done. And you begin to ask, are there any redeemable qualities in them? And they simply say, no, they're just write them off. And you have to ask yourself when you're in that circumstance, is that the way God sees them? God who loved them so much that he sent his one and only son to die for them. When you remove the plank and you begin to see a little bit more clearly, you take on God's perspective. And finally, you see the other person more clearly. You begin to see them for who they are. The good, the bad, the ugly, but you can see them with compassion, with grace. The same grace that God's chosen for you. And if you just follow this formula of first taking the plank out of your own eye, and then as gently as possible, with so much discernment and grace, to gently restore the person that may have hurt you deeply or may have caused you insult somewhere along the way, God will begin to position your heart in a way that you'll be able to approach even the most difficult, really, really difficult conversations, and you'll be able to handle it well. Why don't you bow your heads and close your eyes with me today? I know in a room like this, it's hard. You may in your marriage have just accepted the status quo, and maybe you tried to engage in conversations, but you finally just given up, raised your hands, and said, I guess this is the best it's going to be. Or maybe you're in a relationship that you know you need to get out of. Or maybe you're in a business partnership and there's some things that are now dredging up in your heart and you're starting to feel resentful and you're starting to feel bitter. God has something so much greater for you. And there is a third option. Rather than violence and rather than silence, God wants you to be able to speak the truth in love. But it starts first with you looking at your own heart and your own motives and your own fears and taking a courageous journey to take the plank out of your own eye so that you're better positioned to help somebody else. And I just want to pray with you. Would you take a moment and just courageously look at your own heart? Maybe you have some sinful addictions or some sinful motives or just some hateful attitudes. And you want to just surrender that to the Lord.